My name is Ethan Wells. I'm 47 years old. I spent nearly 15 years as the director of marketing for one of the most respected tech firms in the city. I was the kind of guy who stayed late without being asked, who remembered birthdays, who brought the department through 2 major crises without a single layoff. I never needed to raise my voice or demand recognition. I believed that results spoke louder than applause, but that belief was tested the day my own boss tried to turn a room full of colleagues into my jury. It was our quarterly all-hands meeting. The executive board sat lined up in front like judges in a courtroom, while every department head gave their update. When it came time for my boss, the VP of Operations, to speak, he opened with a joke, a lazy one. "Everyone here brings value," he said, chuckling, "except maybe the failure in marketing." Laughter erupted like a cue in a sitcom, only it wasn't scripted, and all eyes turned to me. My chest stayed still, but something inside me cracked clean in two. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look down. I just stood up, reached into my leather briefcase, and placed a sealed folder on the center of the conference table. I looked straight at the board and said, "For the board's review." My voice was calm, clear, no emotion. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't storm off or slam a door. I just walked, every footstep echoing against the silence that followed. No one said a word. The moment the doors closed behind me, I felt a shift. Not fear, not humiliation, power. The kind that comes when you know something others don't. Because that folder wasn't just a report, it was evidence. Numbers, emails, decisions made in closed rooms that I had quietly documented over the past 18 months. And it told a story they weren't ready to hear. A story that started at the top. I reached the elevator and pressed the button. My hands were steady. I wasn't angry. I was done. There's a difference, and that difference is what gives you clarity. The kind of clarity that lets you walk away with your dignity and tact. No yelling, no arguing, just facts, silence, and timing. And the one thing they never expected, control. Just as the elevator doors began to close, I heard it, shoes sprinting down the hallway, a voice calling my name. The CEO, out of breath, face flushed. "Ethan, wait." But I didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes making them chase you is the first step in showing them just how far ahead you've already walked. Comment, never let them humiliate you quietly, if you'd walk away with your power like this. Loyalty is a quiet virtue. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't wave a flag. It just shows up early, prepared, committed. That's what I gave them for 15 years. I built that department from a dusty storage room into the engine behind their most successful campaigns. I mentored interns who became managers. I sat through weekend meetings, red-eyed and running on bad coffee, just to make sure every launch went smoothly. And yet, none of that mattered in that moment. Because someone with a louder voice needed a scapegoat. I remember the first sign looking back. It was subtle. The budget cuts that only applied to my team. The praise I used to get forwarded from clients that suddenly stopped landing in my inbox. When they began ceasing me instead of addressing me directly, I should have known. But loyalty makes you blind sometimes. It makes you think, this must be a phase. I'll weather it. It'll pass. But what passes isn't the storm. It's your respect for yourself if you're not careful. The night after that meeting, I didn't sleep. Not because I was hurt, but because I was awake in a new way. I started reviewing my memories like puzzle pieces. I had once tried to force together every overlooked insult, every meeting I wasn't invited to, every credit taken for work I had done. Suddenly, it all formed a complete picture, and in the center of that picture was one truth. I had been loyal to people who never intended to be loyal to me. But I didn't want revenge. that looked like bitterness. I didn't want to yell or demand apologies. That's not power. Power is composure. Power is watching their ship take on water and knowing you don't need to scream because you're already in a lifeboat of your own making. The trick, I realized, was to never let betrayal change your character, only your direction. I stayed silent in the days that followed. No social media posts, no gossip. I didn't even tell my closest friends what had happened. That silence scared them more than rage ever could. They didn't know if I had walked out in defeat or with a plan, and that uncertainty, that vacuum of knowledge, became my leverage. But even in silence, I grieved. You can't bury 15 years of belief in one evening. I had believed in that company, in those people, in that mission. What I lost wasn't just a job. It was a version of myself that thought hard work alone was enough. That's what betrayal really is. The realization that effort doesn't always earn you safety. Sometimes it earns you envy. And envy wears the face of a compliment until it doesn't. While they scrambled to decipher my silence, I got to work. I wasn't interested in gossip or vindication. I was interested in precision. Over the years, I'd kept a quiet archive, not because I ever planned to use it, but because I believe in tracking what you build. Old pitch decks, client conversion data, revenue timelines that traced back to the campaigns my team had led. But as I began reviewing it all, I realized something they hadn't. The numbers told a story that couldn't be denied. Buried in those reports was a clear correlation. Every quarter where the company showed substantial growth, my department had been behind the push. Not operations, not sales, marketing, and not just any marketing. The strategies I personally developed. Their top 3 accounts, I had initiated the relationship. The partnership that expanded their international reach. I wrote the proposal from a hotel lobby at 2 a.m. while they slept. They used to thank me for that. Then they started pretending it was their idea. I also had emails, ones they forgot about, messages where I warned them of risks, predicted downturns, advised against campaigns they approved anyway, and I saved the fallout, numbers that proved my predictions had been accurate. These weren't gotcha moments, they were patterns, and when presented correctly, patterns become proof, the kind of proof boards don't ignore. I reached out to a lawyer I trusted, not to sue but to understand the fine print of my contract, my contributions, and more importantly, what counted as intellectual property. As it turned out, the internal software tool we'd developed to streamline campaign data had been my idea, built from my original framework, and I still had the early design notes, time-stamped and signed. That changed everything. My next step wasn't loud, it was a calm email to the board's assistant. I requested a private meeting with select members, not as an employee, but as a consultant. I offered to walk them through the folder I had left behind, with full transparency and no legal accusations. Yet, I didn't threaten, I didn't demand. I gave them a choice, clarity or chaos. They took the meeting, and for the first time in my career, I watched people who once ignored my voice hang on every word, not because I raised it, but because they finally realized whose voice had always driven the results. Their silence, in that room, was the most satisfying applause I'd ever received, and I wasn't even done yet. That private meeting was the start of something they couldn't control. I didn't walk in with arrogance. I walked in with clarity. The kind that unnerves people who've built their confidence on the assumption that others won't speak up. I laid out the data. I showed them the original framework for the campaign software they now considered a company asset. I walked them through the patterns they'd ignored and the growth they'd quietly taken credit for. It wasn't an attack, it was simply the truth, laid bare like clean glass on the table. I could see it in their faces. The board members, they weren't angry with me. They were disappointed with themselves. Not because I had revealed something new, but because deep down, they knew they should have seen it sooner. That's the thing about quiet workers. We become invisible, not because we lack value, but because we don't demand attention. Until one day, our absence feels louder than our presence ever did. Meanwhile, back inside the company walls, things started to shift. Rumors trickled through the halls. My former team was being questioned about old projects. The VP, who mocked me at the meeting, he looked rattled, people said, couldn't keep eye contact, kept calling impromptu meetings. No one wanted to attend. His confidence, once unshakable, now looked like an act. Because here's what they didn't know. I had already started conversations with two of our biggest clients, the ones I had personally brought in, and those clients were more loyal to me than they were to a logo. One of those clients even told me, "If you ever go independent, we'll follow." I hadn't asked. I hadn't hinted. They just said it. That sentence lived in my mind like a match waiting to be struck. Because I didn't need to destroy the company. I just needed to remove what they couldn't replace. My trust, my relationships, my mind. Without that, they weren't growing. They were coasting on borrowed time. The CEO reached out next, not through an assistant, not through a board member. He called me directly. His tone was soft, cautious. He asked how I was. He apologized carefully, without using too many specific words. He asked if we could meet. I told him I'd think about it. That pause was deliberate. Power doesn't always come from saying no. Sometimes it comes from letting them sit in silence with the weight of your decision. I ended that day sitting alone in a cafe near the river, the same one I used to visit during lunch breaks. Only this time, I wasn't checking my phone for updates. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was still, and in that stillness, I understood something. I had already won, not because they were losing control, but because I had finally taken mine back fully, quietly. It started slowly, like a thread being pulled loose from a tailored suit. First, the VP who humiliated me was reassigned to a non-strategic role, the kind of internal exile that's more about containment than correction. They didn't announce it publicly, but word spreads fast in a company like ours. The man who once walked the halls with smug certainty now moved like a shadow of himself, nodding at people who no longer respected him. He hadn't just lost control, he had lost the illusion of being untouchable. Then came the restructuring emails, phrases like transition, strategic realignment, and long-term growth vision. But everyone knew what it meant. The board had finally started asking hard questions. The numbers they used to blindly celebrate were now under a microscope, and with that scrutiny came revelations. Missed opportunities, overstated contributions, projects greenlit against internal advice, advice that I had documented and archived. It was all there, in writing, dated, irrefutable. I didn't return to the building. I didn't need to. My presence was still in the rooms they now feared enter. My name was brought up in hush-toned meetings, in side conversations at the water cooler, in nervous glances when someone said, "What if he?" But I didn't. I wasn't suing. I wasn't seeking revenge in the courts. What I had done was far more lasting. I had made them confront their own blindness. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. The CEO finally emailed me again. This time, there were no corporate phrases, no softened edges, just a few lines. "We made a mistake. I made a mistake. I hope you'll give us a chance to make things right." I read it twice, not with satisfaction, not with malice, but with understanding. Because here's the part they always forget. When you wrong someone who built your foundation, you're not just hurting a person, you're shaking the entire structure, and it will crumble, not with an explosion, but with quiet, persistent cracks. I replied, briefly. I thanked him for the message, told him I held no grudge, but I declined the invitation. No bitterness, just boundaries. You see, I had already begun consulting on my own. 3 clients, 2 of them former partners of the company, and one of them had just offered me a seat at the table. Not as an employee, but as an equity partner. The silence I left behind had bloomed into opportunity, and I didn't need to look back to validate it. You don't need to ruin someone to redeem yourself. Sometimes walking away, fully, peacefully, powerfully, is the loudest statement you can ever make. And when they finally realize it, they won't remember what you said. They'll remember what you didn't. I always thought starting over would feel like failure, like going back to square one. But starting over isn't the same when you carry everything with you. Your knowledge, your integrity, your reputation. Those are things they can't revoke. I began working from my home office. No titles, no status. Just me and a whiteboard full of strategies that no one else had the vision to draw up. And for the first time in years, I could breathe. Clients began reaching out quietly at first, asking how I was doing, checking if I had availability for some advice. They weren't just being kind, they were watching the headlines too. They saw the shift in leadership, the drop in momentum, the press release that read like damage control. The word was out. The mind behind the machine had left. And those who once overlooked my contributions now wanted to know what I was building next. I didn't rush into anything. Power without direction is just noise. I took the meetings. I listened. I asked questions no one else asked them, about values, about culture, about long-term strategy instead of quarterly gain. And slowly something started forming. Not a job, not a company, a legacy, something of my own. Rooted in everything they had dismissed, watered by every doubt they ever cast on me. I hired a small team, people I trusted. Not the loudest, not the most polished, but the kind of people who stay late, not for credit, but because they care. I saw myself in them, and I swore never to become the kind of leader who feeds off fear or silence. My first contract was with a company we used to compete against. They had always admired our marketing. They just didn't know it had been my vision, until now. In that first meeting, the CEO said something that stuck with me. He said, "Ethan, you never needed a brand to stand behind. You were the brand." And that's when it clicked. They hadn't humiliated me at that meeting. They had freed me. What felt like an ending was actually the clearest beginning I'd ever stepped into. Not all freedom is loud. Sometimes it's quiet mornings, your own pace, your own clients, your own standards. Sometimes it's knowing that the worst day of your career gave birth to the most powerful version of yourself. Back at the company I left, silence had turned into whispers, not just about me, about everything, about decisions made in fear, leadership built on arrogance, and a culture that had lost its spine the moment it lost its soul. I didn't have to say a word. People talk when they sense truth has left the building, and the truth was, my absence had exposed everything they tried to bury under performance reviews and company jargon. An ex-colleague reached out, someone who had kept their distance before. He said, "It's different without you. There's no clarity, just noise." He wasn't the only one. Emails trickled in from employees I barely remembered, people who had seen what happened that day in the boardroom and felt something crack open inside them. "You gave us permission to stop pretending," one of them wrote. They weren't talking about marketing. They were talking about dignity. Meanwhile, my small consultancy grew. One client turned into three into five. We weren't flashy, we weren't everywhere. But the results spoke louder than any campaign I'd ever led. My team was tight, efficient, respected, and best of all, happy. There was no posturing, no sabotage, just work done well, and clients who finally understood that authenticity doesn't need to be dressed up to be powerful. One day, during a strategy meeting, I got a call from someone unexpected, the new VP of operations at my old company, the one they brought in after mine fell apart under scrutiny. She was direct, professional. She said, "I've heard your name more than my own since I joined." Then she asked something no one had dared to ask before. "Would you consider training our executive team on brand integrity?" I smiled. It was tempting, not out of ego, but out of poetic symmetry. The man who was mocked in front of the entire board, now invited back to teach that same board what they never understood about leadership, trust, and strategy. But I didn't answer right away. Some victories are sweeter when savored slowly, with reflection. Not every door that opens again is one you're meant to walk through. So I ended that day in my own office. Windows open, soft jazz playing, the scent of coffee still warm in the air. No tension, no hierarchy, just purpose. And for the first time in years, I looked in the mirror and saw not a title, not a survivor, but a man who chose himself, even when others tried to erase him. They say revenge is best served cold. But the truth is, the sweetest revenge doesn't need to be served at all. It happens naturally, when time reveals what pride tried to hide. I never intended to return to that boardroom, but life has a strange way of bringing things full circle when you've made peace with never needing closure. That invitation to speak, I accepted it, not for them, for myself, for the version of me that once sat silently while others tried to shrink his voice. I walked in through the same glass doors, but everything felt different, not because the building had changed, but because I had. The security guard nodded, with more respect. The receptionist smiled a little longer. And when I stepped into the conference room, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the man they once dismissed. I felt like a standard, one they now understood they should have never overlooked. The faces were different. A few old board members remained, but their posture had changed. Less bravado, more listening. And seated among them were new hires, fresh eyes waiting to hear the man who had once walked out without raising his voice. I didn't rehash the past. I didn't point fingers. I spoke about resilience, about the cost of ignoring quiet loyalty, about the power of integrity, not just in branding, but in leadership. They asked questions, they took notes. And when it was done, they clapped, not the polite, corporate kind. The kind that comes from recognition, from regret, from respect. Afterward, the CEO pulled me aside. He looked tired, not older, just sobered. He didn't say much, just 5 words. "I'll never forget. You were right. I'm sorry." I nodded. Forgiveness doesn't need an audience. Sometimes it just needs eye contact and truth. As I left the building, I passed the office where I once worked. The nameplate had changed. But I didn't feel loss. I felt legacy, not the kind that's engraved on doors. The kind that lingers in the systems you built, the people you taught, and the silence you left behind, that still speaks louder than the man who once tried to humiliate you. I didn't look back when the elevator doors closed. Some chapters end best when you close them without rereading the final page. I had become everything they didn't see in me, not in spite of their rejection, but because I no longer needed their permission to rise. There's a quiet moment in every story where the storm has passed, the dust has settled, and you realize you never needed to win the way you thought you did. That moment came for me on a Sunday morning, long after the meetings, the apologies, the whispered admiration from former colleagues. I was sitting in my backyard, sipping coffee as the sun rose, when I finally felt it: freedom, not success, not vindication, just peace. Real peace. It didn't come from proving them wrong. It came from proving myself right about who I was, what I stood for, and what I deserved. Because what they took from me wasn't a job. What they tried to rob me of was belief. Belief that quiet strength matters, that integrity is still currency, that kindness and strategy can coexist. But belief, when it's rooted deep, survives even the harshest drought. I never wanted revenge. I wanted evolution, growth, a life beyond the walls of that building, where my worth wasn't dependent on someone else's insecurities. That's the part they didn't understand. When you betray someone who builds quietly, you don't create an enemy, you forge a leader, one who doesn't need applause, one who doesn't seek destruction, one who simply walks toward something better without looking back. That better life was now mine. Mine consultancy had tripled in size. I was mentoring young professionals who reminded me of the man I once was, eager, principled, hopeful, and I was building something lasting, not just in business, but in character, because no matter how many contracts I signed or how many clients I helped, nothing felt better than knowing I never had to become bitter to become powerful. I sometimes hear about my old boss, how he struggles to lead, how people don't trust him like they once did. I feel no satisfaction in that. Only clarity. He tried to shrink me in front of a crowd, and in doing so, he revealed his own limitations to everyone who mattered. I didn't have to expose him. He did that himself the moment he let arrogance take the place of wisdom. True power isn't about walking into a room and demanding respect. It's about walking out and having respect follow you anyway. And when people ask me how I stayed so calm, how I didn't retaliate, I just smile and tell them the truth. I didn't need revenge. I became the kind of man they could never destroy. There's a kind of beauty that only arrives after everything falls apart. The beauty of a life you chose, not one you settled into. Mine came in the form of slow mornings, a schedule I controlled, and work that actually made me proud again. I wasn't chasing validation. I wasn't performing for a paycheck. I was finally aligned with purpose, with peace, with power that wasn't given to me but reclaimed. The clients I worked with weren't just numbers or logos. They were people who valued thoughtfulness over flash, depth over noise. And when they asked why I left my last job, I always gave the same answer: because I stopped being useful to people who only wanted someone to blame. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. And the more I lived in that truth, the more it opened doors I never thought I'd walk through. One of the companies I advised ended up offering me a board seat. Another asked if I'd mentor their rising talent. I was no longer seen as the marketing guy. I was seen as a builder, a strategist, a man who'd walked through fire and refused to burn. And the irony, the very thing they tried to shame me for, my quiet, steady nature, became the foundation of everything I had built since. I visited my old office building once more, not for a meeting, but just to walk past it. It felt smaller than I remembered. The kind of place that could no longer contain who I had become. I paused outside, not with resentment, but with a kind of distant gratitude. That was the place where I was broken, yes, but also the place where I outgrew my silence and chose my voice. I thought about the young man who had walked into that company all those years ago, wide-eyed, hopeful, willing to give everything for a seat at the table. And I realized I had built a better table, one with no head, no hierarchy, just respect passed around like oxygen. That was the real victory. Not getting even, but getting free. If you're reading this or watching or listening and you've been humiliated, underestimated, or dismissed, let them laugh. Let them call you small. Let them think they've won. Then walk away, build something stronger, and let the silence carry your name farther than their shouting ever could. There comes a point when you stop measuring your life in wins and losses and instead begin to measure it in truth. I didn't walk out of that company as a victor. I walked out as a man who had finally remembered who he was before the world tried to reduce him. That's the part they never understood. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the last courtesy I gave before reclaiming my strength. I never had to scream. I never had to expose anyone. I simply placed the truth on the table and walked out with my dignity. And that single act, that moment of calm power, did what no argument ever could. It made them confront themselves. That's what real growth looks like. When your absence causes more reflection than your presence ever did. My life now isn't perfect, but it's mine. I work with people who value trust over tactics. I spend my days creating, mentoring, and learning. I end my nights in peace, not exhaustion. And I never again confuse a paycheck with purpose. That clarity, it's worth more than any title they could have ever dangled in front of me. There are no heroes in my story, only lessons. Lessons about boundaries, about dignity, about the quiet strength of walking away without needing an audience, and perhaps most of all, about how sometimes the betrayal that breaks you is actually the blessing that builds you into someone wiser, freer, and untouchable. So if you've ever been made to feel small, in a boardroom, in a relationship, in a place where you gave your all, remember this: their words don't define you, their laughter doesn't last, and their opinion loses its power the moment you stop needing it. I didn't get revenge. I didn't come back to prove them wrong. I simply moved forward and made them irrelevant. Dylan, if this story spoke to your soul, drop a comment below that says, "I choose silence, strength, and self-respect." You never need to fight fire with fire. Just become the water that can't be burned.